Today, I'm going to be talking about pets. Not the cute, cuddly kind you keep in your house, but the monsters you bring onto the battlefield to help you slay the Horde. It turns out there's actually a couple of combinations of pets that you might not realize are actually OP. Pets end up being a big part of your power, particularly early and then again late. So it's good to know which ones are the best and how to use them. You can think of pets as another weapon, and they scale off of both your weapon power and their power score. So I'm going to give you the best pet setups for normal mode and hard mode, nightmare mode, hard mode arena, and all the other special game modes. Because not all pets are created equal. We all know dogs are way better than cats. And I'm Coles, a high-level HVH player. You can sign up for my Patreon or become a member on YouTube for a monthly HVH giveaway. But now, on to pets. So you first unlock pets at level 100. And at the beginning of the game, they are incredibly strong. So you want to get to chapter 100 as quick as you can, because they'll give you a big power boost. Back in my day, we didn't have pets, and so you just had to figure out how to grind through those next 100 chapters all by yourself. The general rule of thumb I give for pets is to use the highest rarity pet that you have. Now, that works in most situations, particularly when you first get pets, but after that, there are some better setups. So I'll start out at the very beginning and work from there. So let's start out at your very first pet setup. The first one that I would go with is a snail. Now, snails aren't particularly strong, but they will be valuable later in the game, and so any leveling you do to a snail is actually worth it and will stick around for a while. So if your very first pet is one of these regular common guys, go with a snail and work on getting him up to level 100. But then you'll start to get great pets, at which point you want to start leveling up either a Flamestriker or an Earthstriker. The reason for that is that the Flamestriker's passive at level 100 adds burning to the main pet's attack, which will be useful later in the game. And the same thing with Earthstrikers, they add slow to the basic attack. So those will be somewhat valuable, and any levels you put into them won't be wasted. So early in the game, your setup might be something like this, with the Flamestriker as your main pet and your snail that you leveled up as your passive pet. Now, you unlock passives at level 100 for the pet, and they buff up the main pet normally, the one exception is being snails, which I'll talk about later. But for now, you should have an elemental and you should have a snail. Open up enough eggs and you'll eventually get your first rare pet, either an Emberpaw or a Pyrocrankin. Now, I have a personal preference for Pyrocrankin because he's a ranged pet and Emberpaw is a melee pet. That means that Pyrocrankin should be able to hit more Horde more easily than Emberpaw, because Emberpaw has to run in and Pyrocrankin can just stay back. So if you get both of them, I would favor leveling Pyrocrankin before Emberpaw. That would then make your early game setup look something like this, with Pyrocrankin as your main pet and then a Flamestriker and a snail as your passives, because you were leveling those up as you were grinding out more pets. Now, your big goal here is to get Pyrocrankin to level 200. At level 200, he gets his active effect, which throws more bombs and hits more Horde, basically amping his damage pretty substantially. Your goal then is just to unlock more rare pets and add them as your passives. So a very common setup might be something like Pyrocrankin as your main pet with your Flamestriker as your passive and Emberpaw as your other passive. And then depending on the playstyle and which pet you like better, you could make Emberpaw your main and Pyrocrankin your passive. I used this particular setup for a long time. I was here for the beta in pets, and it took me something like 200 normal eggs to finally hit Hydrobasilisk, which is my first epic pet. Once you hit Hydrobasilisk, you're actually set for most of the game. Many endgame players actually prefer Hydrobasilisk over a lot of the other pets, and he's super strong in certain game modes. So getting to your first epic, if it's Hydrobasilisk, is really good. The other epic pet you might hit is Stormgriffin. Now, he's not as good as Hydrobasilisk, but he's perfectly fine to use if you hit him. And as you hit these epic pets, you basically take your rare pets and you move them over to the passives. So then the standard setup becomes Hydrobasilisk with Pyrocrankin and Emberpaw. This will give you the most damage for basically any game mode you want, including normal mode, hard mode, arena, boss brawl, all the good ones. Literally any part of the game up until nightmare mode, you can use this setup. And this is why I say use your rarest pet with the other two highest rarities as passive. Now, the one thing to note is I don't recommend using Hydrobasilisk or Stormgriffin as passives. They're just not very strong relative to these other two. And that's because of how pet damage is calculated. You can think of pets as another weapon, and they scale off of both your weapon power and their power score. So the higher level you get them, the more damage they do. And the higher your damage, the more damage they do. And that's why you also choose these particular pets as passives. When you look at their passive abilities, it'll tell you what percent of damage that they do when their abilities attack. The higher that percentage, the more damage they'll do overall. Don't worry about the exact wording. Swift is really bad at being consistent here, but the percentages are what matter. And because Hydrobasilisk and Stormgriffin don't have percentages based into their attacks, they're not as valuable as these other two rare pets in terms of passive. Now, this will be your standard build for a lot of the game. Hydrobasculus with these two passives is quite strong. Over time, you can open enchanted eggs. These used to be available in events, but they've been much less so recently. So you might have to spend gems in order to get them, which is unfortunate. But it takes about 84 of them on average to unlock Crystalsaurus. Crystalsaurus, while very strong, only upgrades over Basculus when you can level it up past level 400. So while he's got a higher cap, Basculus is actually pretty good. So don't worry if you don't want to spend the gems or the event currency in order to open enchanted eggs. That said, as you open enchanted eggs, you also get access to Owl. Owl's passive is one of the best in the game. Because that percentage is 50% of damage, it's one of the highest multiples available outside of other extremely rare epic and legendary pets. So opening enchanted eggs has two benefits. You get access to Crystalsaurus and to Owl, which becomes your late game max DPS pet. For reference, my max DPS late game build includes Crystalsaurus as my main pet with Hydrobasculus and Owl as my passive. I haven't been lucky enough to get access to those super rare epic pets from events, and so this is my max DPS setup and can be achieved through just enchanted eggs and normal eggs. But you don't always need max DPS, and in certain game modes you actually switch up your builds accordingly. The first is Nightmare mode. Remember how I said that leveling up a snail won't go to waste? Well, snails become incredibly valuable in Nightmare mode. If you read a snail's passive, it increases the health of the hero by 15%. And if you use two snails, they multiply together. So it's 15 plus 15 is 30%. 30% more HP is incredibly valuable in late game modes like hard mode arena and particularly in Nightmare mode. The goal of Nightmare mode is to survive, and 30% extra health will help you survive much easier. So that's why I recommended leveling up a snail as your first pet, because you can combine them with Crystalsaurus or with Hydrobasculus to run in Nightmare mode. You'll also see that pets are extremely OP in Nightmare mode. While you're too busy running around trying not to let Horde hit you, your pets just constantly DPS. And it's not uncommon for Crystalsaurus or Basculus to be your highest DPS source by a wide margin. If you have enough DPS in your hero and the pet, you can run this in hard mode arena, although that can sometimes be a stat check on your damage, and so you might have to run more aggressive damage dealing passive. You can then also go for hybrid approach, which is one passive snail and one passive damage pet. In a game mode like Dragon's Tower or Hero Clash, it might make sense to do a hybrid approach, where you take a passive pet for damage and then another passive pet like a snail for more HP. That'll give you some more survivability because you will get hit by Horde, but it also gives you the damage boost of having a strong pet like Owl, or maybe something like Pyrocrankin. And these are the very typical endgame pet builds. Now there is a special case for Boss Brawl. Crystalsaurus is a really strong pet for doing massive AoE damage, but in Boss Brawl there's only one boss. And in that case, Hydrobasculus actually does more targeted DPS. So for that reason, I run Hydrobasculus as my main pet. That'll give you the most single target DPS. I'm also starting to hit the point in the game where I need to apply so many statuses to the boss that I can't do it via weapon, in which case you can do this unique build. Because of the way that Elemental Striker's passives work, they only impact the pet's main attack. But again, in Boss Brawl, you're only hitting one target. So in that case, you can switch out your secondary pet for a Flamestriker. Flamestriker give each pet's attack the ability to apply burning onto the boss. If your hero doesn't have burning in their kit, Flamestriker will apply it to the boss, and so you can get other weapons that'll apply more statuses or do more damage. And again, that's why we decided to level up Flamestriker earlier in the game. So there was no wasted progress when you leveled up your Snail and your Flamestriker because they become valuable in the endgame also. I also use Hydrobasculus as my main pet in Dragon's Tower. Hydrobasculus' active effect provides geysers that heal you. And because there's no healing in Dragon's Tower, you can actually heal back your hero some using these geysers over the course of many floors, making Hydrobasculus a really good take in Dragon's Tower. Now, I got super lucky and got both Owl and Crystalsaurus after opening about 30 enchanted eggs, and I did it over the course of many months using event currency. If you get lucky or you have the ability to spend, you can get access to some even better pets in special events. And there's two that I want to focus on. The first is Blazetail. Blazetail is the single best pet in the game. It does the most damage for any pet by a pretty significant margin. Level this guy up to level 500 and he can clear out most of the game just by himself. If you ever have the opportunity and means to grab Blazetail, he's definitely worth it. The other big one to know about is Shellshock. Shellshock has the best passive in the game, and that's again because of the multiple on the damage to his shells. The issue is these shells are really small, so the AoE area is not very big, but you can pair it with something like Crystalsaurus that stands in the middle of Horde in Nightmare mode or hard mode arena, and it'll do a substantial amount of damage. Again, you're looking for multiples here on the passives. Now, the one catch for all pet setups is that you can only equip one of each type of pet once. So you can't have Hydrobascles as your main with 2 Pyro Crankings as your passive. So you're going to have to mix and match as you go. One more important thing to know is that Cloudhoo's passive actually does damage and is supposed to be very strong. And that would make your optimal pet setup assuming you have access to all the pets. Something like Blazetail as your main pet, with Crystalsaurus and Cloudhoof as your passives. Very few people in the game are going to have access to all those legendary pets, but if you do, congratulations. They're quite strong. But for all of us regular free-to-play players, know that getting Crystalsaurus or even Hydrobasculus is perfectly fine for clearing out every game mode in the game. And that's my guide to pet setups. Most of the time, you're using your highest rarity pet as your main pet, with your next 2 highest rarities as your passive pets. But I gave you the special occasions where you can swap out those guys for niche situations. Just remember, pets are your strongest weapon, so use them accordingly. And I'm Coles, a high-level HVH player. You can subscribe to my Patreon or become a member on YouTube for early access to videos and a monthly HVH giveaway. You can also become an executive producer. The executive producers of this video are Cake Invictus, Riverwind, The Wubba, Charlos, Krabs, Dustin, Jason, Lady Ikaika, and Paradox. Thank you all so much for your support. Please subscribe if you like the content, and remember, always do your adventures! I had a pet dog once, but it had a heart murmur, and so my mom and dad returned it.